In the last video, we had a look at the basic setup of our form. Now let's understand how Angular creates such a JavaScript object representing our form in the template-driven approach. The great thing is, you don't have to do anything. Well, almost anything. Make sure that in your app module, you actually import the forms module added here to your imports array and have the import at the top of this file. As the name implies, this built-in module shipping with Angular includes a lot of forms-related functionalities and is actually needed to get this template-driven approach to work, to get this form creation by Angular to work. Now, by default in a CLI project, this should already be imported, so it should work fine. But again, I'm just highlighting it because it's super important that you have this import. Otherwise, the following steps will not work. With this imported, Angular will actually automatically create a form for you, so a JavaScript representation of that form, when it detects a form element in HTML code, like it does here. So you can think of that form element serving as a selector for some Angular directive, which then creates such a JavaScript representation of the form for you. Of course, you can't see that form representation as of now, and it would be very empty, because one thing does not happen automatically. Angular will not automatically detect your inputs in this form. And the simple reason for this is that whilst you could argue that it should be able to scan your HTML code and detect that you have an input here, and that you have a select dropdown here, you still might not want to add all these elements as controls to your form. So with control, I'm referring to what is in the JavaScript object. And again, not every input in your HTML code might be a control you want to have in your JavaScript form. Maybe you have a dropdown which value only changes something you view on the UI, but the input should not actually be part of what gets submitted. Maybe you use some third-party package which adds some custom form controls which are not labeled input, which don't use input as a selector, and then Angular would have no chance of detecting that this is a control of your form. So you still need to register controls manually. You need to tell Angular, hey, within that form element, what should be an actual control of my form? And this is what we're going to do now. Tell Angular, how does our form look like? Which controls do we want to have? In the template-driven approach, this is super simple. You simply pick the input which you want to add as a control, like this input here. And I'm just going to structure it a bit different to split it up over multiple lines to make it easier to read. And then you add ng model, like this. Now, you might already know ng model from the two-way data binding. And it actually is the same directive. In two-way data binding, though, you saw that we used it with squared brackets and parentheses wrapping ng model. Now we will have a look at this later again, but for now, let's add it without any parentheses, without any squared brackets, just like this. This will be enough to tell Angular, hey, this input is actually a control of my form. So ng model in the end is a directive made available in the forms module, something I mentioned earlier in the course when we had a look at two-way data binding. This is key to understand. You can use it to get two-way data binding, but it actually is part of a bigger module with more features, giving you full control over forms. Now, for this to work, for this to be recognized as a control in your form, we need to give Angular one other piece of information: the name of this control. Right now it would see, okay, this input should be part of the JavaScript object representation of this form. So whatever the user enters here as a value should be the value of of this control. But what's the name of that control? We need to give that information to Angular, and we do this by adding the normal HTML attribute name. So name is nothing Angular too specific. Name is the default attribute you can add to any HTML control. Now here the name might be username because that is what we can enter in this input. And with this control will be registered in this JavaScript representation of the form. Now I'll do the same for the email. Restructure it so that it's easier to read, add ng model, and add a name. like for example, email here. Well, and the same is true for the select here, which is just another type of HTML input. Here we can also add ng-model, and we can add a name, like secret, because I'm asking for a secret question here. And with that, we registered all the controls. Of course, we can't see that much though. Well, that is something we're going to have a look at in the next lecture when we see how we can submit such a form and therefore how we can see these key value pairs representing what the user entered into which input. In the last lecture, we configured our form here. We added some controls by placing ng-model on the inputs. Now let's make this form submittable so that we can actually see what the user entered. For this, I'll go to my app component. I already do have a method here which we will use later. Let's ignore it for now. And I'll add a new method on submit maybe. This should be triggered whenever this form is submitted by the user. In onSubmit, I want to output whatever the user entered. Well, first of all, we need to call this method. So back in the template, how can we call onSubmit? Now you might think that a good place would be on a click listener on this button here at the bottom, right? Because this is the button we click when we want to submit the form. However, this is not the best place to do it. Keep in mind that this button here is of type submit, so if we click it as it is placed inside of a HTML form element, something else will happen. The default behavior of HTML will be triggered here, to call it like this. If you have a button in a form element, this button will submit the form, will send a request normally, but besides that, it will also trigger a JavaScript event, the submit event, that's built into JavaScript, built into HTML, you could say. Angular takes advantage of this and gives us a directive we can place on this form element as a whole. It is called ng-submit, and it actually only gives us one event we can listen to. So let's wrap it in parentheses. This event, made available by the ng-submit directive, will be fired whenever this form is submitted, so whenever this default behavior is triggered. And here we can call onSubmit like this, and to show you that this works, I will simply go into onSubmit and log submitted here, just like that. Now if we save this and let it recompile, let's go back and let's open up the developer tools. And if I now hit the submit button, you see submitted here on the right, because indeed the form gets submitted. Now it would be nice to see the actual values of the form though, to see that form object. And to see it, we have to go back to our template, because we're in the template driven approach. So as a rule of thumb, everything you do it in the template. Everything you want to change about this form, you want to add as functionality, you do it in the template. On this form object, we want to get access to the form created by Angular. Now you learned about local references you can place on HTML elements to get access to them. So we could place #F on the form element, and now we could access this form element on, well, the F reference in our template, and we could pass F as an argument to the onSubmit method and print it there. So now we know that we get the form, and actually this will be of type element ref, as we learned. So if we import element ref and make this of type element ref here, and we output the form here, so this element, if we now go back to this and hit submit, yeah, we indeed see that form object. We see some strange classes here, I will come back to them. But that still is not what we want. It's not a JavaScript object created by Angular. But this object is there, we just need to know how to get to it. And there actually is a trick, you could call it, but it's no trick, it's the default way to get access to this automatically created object. You set this local reference equal to something. Now we haven't done that yet, but we can set it equal to something exposed by this form here. Keep in mind, the form element is kind of a selector for a directive built into Angular, which will create this JavaScript object automatically. and then it will expose some data we can fetch here on this form element. We can get access to it by writing ngForm here between the quotation marks. So this might look super strange, but what this in the end does is it tells Angular, hey, please give me access to this form you created automatically. That's just something you have to keep in mind. This is how you get access to the form, to this JavaScript object created by Angular automatically. So, therefore, here where we get this form, we now still pass it. Now this will no longer be an element ref, so let's remove this type here. Instead, this will now be of ngForm. So let's import ngForm from @AngularForms. And it kind of makes sense that it is of type ngForm because that is what we're accessing here. This automatically created form. Now let's print it to the console one more time and let's actually enter something into these fields to see that it worked. If I now type submit here, you see that now we get an ngForm object, an object which we certainly didn't create. And there we have a lot of properties. We'll have a closer look at those later. We also do have a value property. And if we expand this, we indeed see a couple of key value pairs here where we have the names of the controls. So the names we set up here on the name attribute like username and email. We find them here. And then the values the user entered. And this is how we can submit such a form and how we can also get access to the form object created by Angular. We also see that our setup of controls also worked. In the last lecture, we learned how we can submit a form created by Angular and how we can access to this object Angular created for us. Now we had a look at the value property, which stores the input of the user in key value pairs. We see that we also have a lot of our properties. And that's pretty cool about this JavaScript object, about the form handling by Angular. It allows us to really understand the state of our form. We can see which controls we registered here on the controls object, email, secret, and username, and each control is of type form control, of course a type made available by Angular, where each control then has a couple of properties, mostly the same properties we have on the overall form though. And therefore let's go back to that overall form. For example, properties like dirty, disabled, enabled, errors, and most of the properties should be pretty self-explanatory. Dirty, for example, is true because we changed something about that form. If I reload the page and submit it now, you will see that dirty is false because I didn't type into any input. So therefore, of course, dirty is false. Disabled would be true if the form was disabled for some reason. Invalid is false because we haven't added any validators, so it isn't invalid, it is indeed valid. You do have the valid property down here too, so the form is valid right now. We will later learn how to add validators to make sure that a valid email address has to be entered, for example. And we also have touched, for example, to see did we click into some of the fields. The difference to dirty would be that for dirty we have to change the field, have to change the value of a field. For touch we simply have to click into it and now it would be touched. And you will later learn how these properties can be helpful in changing the user experience. For example, disabling the submit button if the form is not valid. I will come back to this later. It's important to understand that you have all these properties and definitely feel free to dive into the output we logged here and understand which properties you have, how they change, which properties the individual controls have, and so on.